Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 27th of September. I'm so sorry for the hiatus. It's probably the last major one I'll have in a while. There were so many exams that I had to finish over this period of time, but now I'm done. We're looking at the war in Ukraine, summary of the past week, so it's going to be filled with a lot of details, going over changes and just more generally tactical overview. In yellow, of course, those are the areas where the Russians have advanced over the past 6 days or so. And we're going to be looking, of course, at Vuhledar first, where a lot of the attention has shifted towards. But again, don't forget about the Pokrovsk front, further southwards around Vovcha River, northwards on the Luhansk front. There were also important developments. Toretsk is also really heating up. So we're going to cover essentially all of it now. And then hopefully in another video, I will discuss the assassination attempt on the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. That's going to be really interesting, and I want to talk about the strategic implications of the event, but I think that I'm going to wait before I make an all-encompassing video because we still don't have enough information to, draw enough conclusions, but definitely that's on my mind. Now also look at actually what's going on in Ukraine. Starting off with the Velika Novosilka sector, you can see that while a lot of the focus is on the city of Vuhledar itself, there have also been movements that are sort of a byproduct of the Russian advances in Prachestivka that are now closing in on Velika Novosilka. Really, really important city, has been for the past 2 years. You can see here in yellow just Russian advance of 1.6 square kilometers. Here, as you click on the geolocation, you'll see on September 21st, so it's been a while, Russian sappers on motorcycles, they advanced from positions in Staromayorsk and Oruzhenie. They were able to clear out Ukrainian positions in trenches near a bridge, rig explosives, and just prepare the pathway for future Russian assaults, which will be concentrated in a really small piece of territory that will be difficult for the Ukrainians to defend on a river valley at ground zero. This is sort of a village hopping strategy that was done with the previous two villages as we discussed, and it's one of the vectors through which the Russians intended to reach the actual city of Velika Novosilka, not to mention their efforts that really could play a role in the future from the Prachestivka area. But if we look at the Russian advances here, they're more so focused on advancing northwards, but also eastwards. So in yellow, you can see Russian advances north of the town amounting to 5.6 square kilometers. A lot of these are a bit older from the beginning of the week, so we're going to click on just some of the geolocations to see it for ourselves. This is from the 5th Tank Brigade. They have a column of vehicles, and it's 5 vehicles just clearing tree lines south of Novoukrainka. So you did have large engagement of Russian armored array. Here you have the 40th Marine Brigade, which is, again, one of the main units involved with the Vuhledar operation. They conducted an FPV strike onto a Ukrainian tank south of Ukrainka. And again, this is a part of the back and forth that was occurring at the time. As we go further eastwards, this is from September 22nd, and this is by the time that Russian vehicles from the 40th Brigade were already past the line of contact that I have with this arrow, and they are already dismounting troops in the vast amount of tree lines in fields that are on the western flank of Vuhledar. And in the process of all this, the culmination that we've seen unfold over the past couple of days is this really quick Russian capture of open fields that are on higher elevation in the surrounding regions, including an abandoned airstrip and a water facility, all taken over by the Russians. Some of these areas included fortified areas, and really a lot of the Ukrainian defense in Vuhledar was banking on the continued holding on to this flank, because although Vuhledar on its own is a really, really formidable defense, it's not an island. It really isn't, because you can't disassociate it from all of the surrounding fields. So with the Russians pushing in from the east, that was a really, really big loss for the Ukrainian garrison from the 72nd Brigade that was defending here, and it's a Russian advance horizontally of 7.3 kilometers. You can look at the Ukrainian unit that was meant to defend here, the 58th Motorized Brigade. They were just completely overwhelmed. They really precipitated this by not being able to hold on to Prachestivka, and now the consequences are continuing to be felt. And again, you could see that the nucleus of the Russian strategy has been focused on avoiding direct confrontation, and that's been wildly successful for them. But really, it only can be because of 2 years' worth of attrition in this part of the front line. It didn't just happen over one nighttime. So to look at the situation northeast of Vuhledar for a second, you can see in yellow just some additional Russian advances. A lot of these are something that occurred at the beginning of the week that were then admitted later on as the days passed by Ukrainian sources like Deep State. Deep State really has been slow in terms of updates, and so I've sort of shifted away from only using them as a source. I've never used them primarily, but I've definitely taken a look and given them weight when they talk about Russian advances. given the nature as a Ukrainian source. But now, because of just too many examples of being relatively slow about updates, whether it be earlier on in Robotinia when it was recaptured, in Vuhledar, that's an infamous example. You just can't primarily focus on them while ignoring everything else. But regardless, you can see the Russian forces getting control of the entirety of the Pivne Donbasskaya mine, the one just southeast of Vuhledar over here. And so again, this is just strengthening of positions that the Russians had already stormed in the middle part of the month. Here you can see the Russians getting control over nearly 2 square kilometers of territory just south of Katerianivka. This is important because, again, shaping the battlefield in a way where the Russians are in control of heights. Heights are located over here, pushing back the 61st Jaeger Brigade, pushing back 79th Area Assault Brigade, pushing back 118th, I believe it is, or 116th Territorial Defense Brigade. These are the units that are acting as the vanguard for Ukrainian forces in this chain of villages. And this is going to be a way for the Russians to avoid having to directly assault the village from the east by pushing from the south as well. But also having control of the southern flank more generally, it includes higher elevated areas and new positions through which to launch attacks towards Vuhledar. So that's what we saw. Now to actually look at the urban combat here. Again, given the fact that the situation is developing here, I would assume at this point that the Russians are in control of more territory than I have marked on my map, and that the gray zone is larger than I have iterated. So the Ukrainian line of contact in blue is probably not the best expression at the moment, but I think that by tomorrow I'll have enough time to really hone in on where exactly everything is located. Here in yellow, you can see Russian advances that amounts of 5 square kilometers, advances that occurred either from the south directly from the Pavlivka-Mikhailske area. This is one region, but primarily I believe it comes from the Pivne Donbasskaya, or I should say Yuzhno Donbasskaya coal mine along this highway and along some of the nearby fields, pushing into the rural and nature regions in eastern Vuhledar, and then from there actually storming into the first outskirts. This occurred around, if we're zooming in, September 24th. That's when you had the first troops really create a base there of operations from the 29th Combined Arms Army. And at the same time, of course, it was really prepared for with a massive strike of TOS-1A shelling. But it's not just that. Massive FAB strikes, CAB strikes, artillery shelling all day, MLRS strikes, of course, FPV drones. Also the Russians, they began to utilize the Dragon drones, the ones that the Ukrainians introduced at the beginning of the month, the ones that, they mix aluminium with rust for the thermite, and then the FPV drone just flies around a certain tree line and sprays that actual thermite, which could reach up to, temperatures of 3,000 degrees Celsius, really would be significant in the sense that it destroys foliage, destroys any sort of camouflage positions, of course, any sort of ammo depot or troops that have clothing that gets caught on fire. That's also very lethal. So the Russians are now beginning to create their own iterations. They're not of the same caliber of the Ukrainians yet, but they've started to utilize them on the outskirts over here. There's footage of that. So definitely a massive Russian preparation. And that's really kept the Ukrainians stuck in their basements in these regions or within the actual buildings, so you don't see any of the troops outside. Understandably, going outside really could be a death trap. So in terms of the estimates of the remaining Ukrainian forces in Vuhledar, I've seen it only from Russian sources, and I really would say that it's probably on the lower end, but the estimates are between 200 to 800. So I would lean towards the 200 number more so than the ones that have been more bombastic, even reaching 1,000. But the actual garrison operating here is largely from the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, which is just incredible to me. This unit has not been rotated out of the fighting once throughout the entirety of the war. You could look at them fighting in the Battle of Kiev or fighting in Bakhmut, Soledar, or then being moved to Vuhledar and just being stuck over here as the main nexus of defense throughout the entirety of the most, recent stage of the battle since 2023, although it started in October 2022, actually. So it's nearly been 2 years since the Russians first launched attacks over here. And that should really show you the durability of Vuhledar. And a lot of the same sort of cast of forces have been involved. But of course, there are within the unit rotations. So certain battalions come out, companies. So it's not the same soldiers, but the actual structure of the unit has been stuck here throughout the entirety of the battle and throughout the entirety of the war more generally. And yeah, the deputy commander of the brigade said they're exhausted. He told Forbes that very recently. And he said that they just simply don't have air defense coverage. So those are just really huge issues. And the way in which the Ukrainians sort of wrote it off is by, acknowledging that it's a very elite unit and then giving it all those responsibilities. But, by the end of August 31st, there are reports, and I'm saying something that, it has a lot of weight, and so I'm not going to, claim it with full certainty. But Syrski, there were reports that he wanted to rotate them out, rotate out the 72nd Brigade and move in the 110th Brigade. A lot of that was mentioned by Ukrainian sources at the time, and it never actually came into fruition. I was always skeptical of the actual operation of rotation being commenced, and so I never changed my map. But it was a very likely possibility. It never actually ended up being enacted. And that's really, really interesting to think about, because 110th Brigade, that's usually a unit that is moved into a conflict zone, like a battle, such as an Avdiivka, to act as a vanguard as the rest of the forces withdraw. So, in all likelihood, the intention was to get the Ukrainians out of Vuhledar by the end of August, early September, and finally cede that territory after resisting for so long. But it appears that even higher than Syrski, there were people coming in, giving pressure perhaps not to conduct that rotation, not to commence an operation, to gradually withdraw, and really to try to hold on to the settlement for as long as possible. And there's a lot of reasons why. There are the political reasons. Zelensky, he is visiting right now in the United States, and the most significant thing that was achieved is in regards to getting Biden to pledge another $8 billion in assistance. He also met with Trump today. And so clearly he's thinking into the long term, trying to get those sort of security guarantees, even from potential presidential, elected officials. And there are prominent Ukrainian channels that are reporting that throughout the visit, there was an emphasis put on Syrski that he shouldn't make any decisions that would have the appearance or would actually create the, sort of circumstances for Russia to gain additional territory, simply because of the optics point of view, in the sense that you wouldn't want to, during an official visit to the United States where you're pitching, the case for why you should receive additional aid, to show that the Russians are actually taking significant territory like in Vuhledar. So that's probably a part of the equation as well. But now it's really reached the point where it's going to be difficult to conduct a large-scale organized withdrawal of the forces from Vuhledar. If you look at it, I'm going to measure it for a second, but you can see that it's a width of 1.8 kilometers, and even that may be an exaggeration at this point, because really stepping out of the buildings is very difficult on its own. And you have, I suppose, this paved road that goes all the way north to here, and then from there you have to branch out into various local paths and open fields before you make it into Bohoyevlenka. There's no paved road that connects Vuhledar to the Ukrainian rear anymore. The Russians already cut it off at this point over here. And of course, even with this very, very, very narrow corridor that the Ukrainians still control or have access to, the Russians are littering it with artillery and FPV strikes, meaning that any attempt to break out really should be done in very small groups. And even then, the chances of success are low. It is still possible, but the casualties will be definitely high. The Russians at the moment, they're dropping leaflets onto the remaining districts that are under the control of the Ukrainians, trying to urge them to surrender. Because the Russians, so far, they've been able to avoid significant casualties due to not actually entering into apartment by apartment and fighting there. They did receive casualties during armored assaults, but not to the same extent that they would have if it was just completely an urban battle. And so now the Russians are trying to, force Ukraine's hand into surrendering over here. The Ukrainian garrisons that may surrender or may not, they're, of course, hiding in the basements at the moment. And it is not just from the 72nd Brigade. There are also some territorial defense elements that were moved in sometime during September to help beef up the defense, to help out the veterans that were defending here. So there's a few units that could be candidates for this, but I think that there was one battalion of the 118th Territorial Defense Brigade that was mentioned. You have this rifle battalion that has been attached to the fighting here for a while, and then you have all these other units that more generally have been defending northwards, including this Territorial Defense unit. And there's no proof that they were fighting in Vuhledar, but they are nearby, so there's always a potential for that actually to unfold. But now to just zoom in, the Russian forces are continuing to very cautiously advance because they want to avoid getting booby-trapped or ambushed or mined or anything like that. So they really are at the eastern edge, but there are reports of them reaching towards school number 2, and so that would be a deeper infiltration as the Ukrainians still remain here. And at least as of the recording of this video, we don't have any information about Ukrainian potential breakout attempt, but they really should be something that they try to embark upon in the very short term, because the Russian forces will just continue to ramp up their fire over here. And then there's also Russian reports at the moment that they physically cut off Vuhledar. I can't confirm that, so my map isn't indicating it, but it's always something that you should just keep in mind. Now, Vuhledar itself, losing it cannot be replicated. No urban type settlement in the region has the same amazing set of conditions that would allow for a 2-year defense. There simply aren't anymore. After the fall of Marinka, Piski, all these other settlements that were built up, Vuhledar, on the other hand, it was surrounded by high elevated areas to the west and to the east that the Ukrainians controlled. Now they don't control those flanks anymore. But even in the center of Vuhledar, with all the high rises, that gives an amazing view, an impeccable view of all the surrounding regions where potential Russian breakthroughs would try to push through. And you don't have that same set of circumstances with Bukhoyevlenko, not only because of the difference in Russian momentum, but also because you don't have massive high rises over here. You don't have the same, sort of understanding of the region, and any engagement that will arrive in this region will be way before the Ukrainians have time to prepare it as a sort of fortress. And so we're not going to see the same sort of long, drawn out stalemate to the extent we saw in Vuhledar and nearby settlements. It could, of course, still take time in the way that it did in various other regions, but I suppose that in comparison to like Konstantinivka, for instance, Bukhoyevlenka is different because it's not that fortified. The Russians are getting control over the higher elevated areas overlooking it. And also, it's not that connected to the rest of the Ukrainian supply arteries in the region, which really are connected to Uspenivka. So that's really an overarching Russian goal looking forward into the future. But yeah, I want to now move on and actually look at other parts of the front line, including the Vavcha River front. Looking at the Kurakhove direction, you can see here in yellow Russian advances. A lot of these happened earlier in the month, but now we just have official confirmation that there are no longer Ukrainian holdouts, you could say, in this region northeast of Maximalianivka. It's an area where we didn't have proof of the Russians operating, but now with the recent deep state updates, it does appear that the Russians have created a spearhead just north of the village of Maximalianivka, with the intention of pushing actually even in between Hostra, not taking it over entirely, but pushing all the way to this local landfill facility, also passing through some nearby quarries. If you zoom in, I think that this is actually the former prison, the prison colony. And so now the Russians are in control of that, meaning that just based on distances, the Russians are about 1.8 kilometers away from Ostrivske, and then from the outskirts of Kurakhove, about 3 kilometers. Really is close, of course, very, very close to the Vavcha River, as an example. Hostra itself has still not been completely taken over, but if it were to fall, then it would really serve as a massive organizational node for future attacks in either direction. It could be in a direction northwards across the river. It could also be in a direction towards the city of Kurakhove, of course. And of course, at the eastern entrance to Kurakhove, that's an area where it's most exposed. It has the least density when it comes to its actual defenses. Now, if we zoom in or zoom out, actually, you can see here that the Russians took over 15.6 square kilometers in the wider Vavcha River pockets. This is just a culmination of the Russians securing control over regions that have previously been abandoned by the Ukrainians. Ukrainians do still maintain control of a lot of these open fields. They're not really built for long-term defense with static positions, but the Ukrainians nonetheless have succeeded in holding on and creating this sort of semicircle shape. And it is all, of course, to buy time for villages west of the river, to buy time for Hurnik's eastern flank that is really critical at the moment. And that's why the fighting is drawn out over here. And the Ukrainians have been successful in just keeping it at sort of slogfest. But again, the Russian forces are not expending that many resources in this region. It's more so smaller scale probing groups that just secure field by field over a prolonged period of time. You have 21st Presidential Brigade involved in a lot of this drawn-out fighting. Also, 59th Motorized Brigade still operating in this region. As you go a bit northwards and look at what's going on in Hurnik, Ukrainian sources, they claim to have pushed back an attack on Hurnik that led the Russians into the northern outskirts. But based on the geolocation, we don't have anything to, I guess, rebuke it yet. So here have a video of a Russian DRG squad on September 26th. They raised a flag on school number 17. It's an advance of 0.6 square kilometers nearly. Looking at the distances, I'm going to measure it for you guys. It's around 1 kilometer almost. So again, you have Russian DRGs bridging the gap between the previous front line, which is centered around this forested region, and then actually making it into the houses. The Ukrainians simply didn't have enough defenses in between, and whatever defenders are here, they're actually in the city itself. So now you're seeing the Russian preparations sort of shaping the battlefield in a way that would allow them to more efficiently clear out Hurnik. So Hurnik at the moment, we're not seeing any sort of intense Russian deep penetration yet, but we are seeing them beginning to be more active on the outskirts. Now, where we're seeing even more activity is just west and south of Ukrainsk. Ukrainsk really has acted as a blossoming flower in the sense that it allowed the Russians to expand in various directions afterwards. So you have this here piece of territory, 1.6 square kilometers, that the Russians took over this past week south of the landfill, and it's all east of Surkunya. This is a really important objective for the Russian forces. They're taking over in the hinterlands, the fields, of course, leading towards it, some of the fortresses that could have been utilized, but again, Ukrainians didn't have time to consolidate and push back the Russians in those regions. So really, they are centered around the actual settlements. So now the Russians, if we're measuring it from the eastern direction, they're only about 1.4 kilometers away. From the north, it's even closer. The Russians are only about 900 meters away. So you do have two directions closing in on this settlement, which would be significant in the sense that it would really sever a lot of the connection between the wider Ukrainian rear, which includes Andriivka. I've talked about it before, but also all these other settlements that are pretty close to the border with Dnipro, you could say. That's the new Ukrainian local rear. And then the Ukrainians that are defending in this sort of cauldron. It's not a complete cauldron, but, the region generally centered around Hirnik. That would be a large means by which to disconnect them. It wouldn't be the end of, communications, but it would just make it more difficult and allow for the Russians to expand even deeper to the Ukrainian sort of western flank of Hirnik, for instance, which really would undermine their long-term defensive prospects in that region. But to just zoom in on the advances for a second, the Russians advancing really along the same axis that they advanced through Ukrainsk, taking over areas past the landfill, including another sort of spoil tip located over here, making it all the way to the windbreaks of the rail line. We have two videos of that. One from the 26th of two infantry fighting vehicles that dismounted troops at a windbreak, and then one from, September 23rd. That's when the first two Russian infantry fighting vehicles made it to the windbreaks for the first time. They conducted a fire mission suppressing Ukrainian fire, and then 2 days later, that's when the Russians actually landed and secured control over this position. And again, more generally, the plan here would be also in regards to Selidove. It's not just about Hirnik. Regarding Selidove, this Russian shaping operation has allowed them to get control over a large portion of the positions and also heights that overlook Selidove, which is on a low-lying river valley, Solona River to be specific. Russians here took over, if we're measuring, 3.6 or 3.16 square kilometers, and then also 2.7 square kilometers. So it is sizable in extent. But within Selidove itself, again, the Russians are not even attempting to go in deeper at this point, simply because the Ukrainians did a good job in consolidating control, moving in reinforcements, and turning the center into a solid base that really isn't worth expending men in anymore. So the Russians are focusing on areas that are more open, where they could utilize small squads, but also armored vehicles to conduct wider breakthroughs. Also around Mariinivka, an area that the Ukrainians have been able to hold on to for an exceptional period of time. Finally, based on Deep State's reporting, the Russians have taken over 2.5 square kilometers almost of territory, including the settlement itself, bar some exceptions, but also some of the trenches nearby. Looking more northwards, you can see that also the Russian forces are beginning to infiltrate and undermine the Ukrainian second to last layer of defense before Pokrvosk. And it really is important the way that they're doing it, because there's a few layers to it, a few stages. So first of all, the capture of most of Hordivka has played a huge role in helping out the Russians locally. Now they have control past the Zhurovka River over here, and they've also been able to reach the anti-tank ditches and trenches that are built to defend. And now they're actually being used by the Russians as a vehicle to attack. They're using the same routes to advance very quickly towards the Ukrainian defensive areas. So that's what they did. They advanced from the west all the way into Mykolaiivka. There's a few videos of that from the Ukrainian side I'm going to click on. You have this video here from September, from the 23rd. This is from the Skala Battalion. Remember, this unit was defending in the Toretsk region, but that's also a critical area. It appears that due to this Russian advance, it was moved to this region over here, as it was viewed of even more importance, higher priority. So Skala Battalion, really strong unit in terms of offensive actions, but also defensive. They conducted cluster and FPV strikes on two Russian soldiers as they made it into eastern Mykolaiivka. And then the fighting from there just pushed on It's a really small settlement centered around one main road. Here you could have a video of the Ukrainian drone spraying thermite onto Russian soldiers in Mykolaiv. Again, a lot of the means by which they're responding is through drones, just spotting the squads that are pushing through the houses and targeting them individually. Here you have a video of a Russian RPG. It hits a counterattacking Ukrainian armored vehicle that was trying to reestablish control over these trenches over here. These are really strong fortress regions that would then help out with retaking Mykolaiv, but they weren't even able to reach the trench region fully before getting targeted by the Russian RPG. So again, that would indicate that there was a Russian proximity to said vehicle, meaning they're also operating north of Mykolaiv in this forested area and also in some of the dugouts. To look at other footage, we have developments around Kruty Yar and Krasny Yar. Again, the Ukrainians from one battalion of the 25th Airborne Brigade, but also 93rd Mechanized Brigade, they were sent in to counterattack and hold on to this semicircle formation in Kruty Yar. And for a couple of weeks, they were successful, but simply it was so disconnected from the Ukrainian actual front line and from everything else supplying it that they couldn't maintain control anymore, especially as the Russians uptake their strikes and offensive activities. And so now you have the Russians in control of all of Kruty Yar. Let's see. This is an older video, but I want to see if there's a video from Krasny Yar. Here you see two FPV strikes by the 25th Brigade, its 3rd Battalion specifically, onto Russian soldiers that were asserting control over the settlement. And then Krasny Yar currently is still a gray zone with the eastern portion under Russian control. But they are pushing through and approaching the trench line in this region as they find another avenue through which to cross it. So again, you're seeing some of the final gaps, the final sort of security zones that the Ukrainians instilled being undermined at the moment. And by that point, you're going to have the final layer of defense, which is essentially the Munirhad outskirts before you actually reach the ring of Pokrovsk itself. And that's where the Russians are currently headed towards. But as we zoom in, we can see that they're also advancing towards Lysivka and Sukhly Yar, taking over 1.8 square kilometers. They've basically reached the trench line over here, but have not crossed over. Here's a video from September 27th of the 25th Airborne Brigade conducting FPV strikes, 3 of them, onto Russian tanks and vehicles that were trying to break through. And so for now, the Ukrainians have been able to keep them at bay. But Sukhly Yar is an area that could be crossed. It's a small settlement, difficult to defend on its own. And when you look at the circumstances, you have this rail line over here, this rail avenue, which is on higher elevation. It's a region that could be infiltrated once the entire second layer of defense collapses. And it's an area that feeds directly into Mirnorod and Pokrovsk. So it's of the utmost importance for the Ukrainian reinforcements here to really prevent the Russians from utilizing it for a broader breakthrough in the future. Looking at Toretsk, first we're going to begin with New York, actually. You can see that just south of the horizontal New Yorkska road, Russians have taken control over some of the remnants of trenches and forested regions, 0.6 square kilometers in territory. Northwards, this is where we received a video from Leonidivka from September 21st, and so I'm not sure about the viability of my frontline reporting at the moment because it's been 6 days since the video was released, but it's of Ukrainian artillery hitting a Russian column that made it all the way into the settlement. It's a very small settlement, but also it runs along the rail line in the Toretsk River, and so the Russian column that advanced here was from the Somalia Battalion, DPR units with a lot of experience, also around the Vovcha Riverfront, and the 9th Motorized Rifle Brigade. So the 2 of them were involved in this assault. Ukrainians, of course, claim to have repelled it. Since then, we have not received any geolocations of fighting elsewhere in this region. So for now, I'm just going to keep the front line the same way as indicated by the geolocation. But of course, things could have changed since then. Meanwhile, in Nelipivka, the Russians are pushing in. They're pushed into this sort of southeastern outskirt of the settlement, and it's rather close to the hospital. Also, they've gotten full control over New York bar one final cluster of houses that is essentially connected by a paved road to Nelipivka itself. It sort of flows into Nelipivka, and that's what the Russians are intending to do, to utilize the momentum from clearing out the northern outskirts of New York to then go in and take out this one of the settlements. Because following the fall of these houses over here, you're not going to have any sort of a large static housing position before the Russians would reach this outer layer of defense, and it's supposed to hold on to Zabalka. The Zabalka district is the southernmost district of Toretsk. Now, if you look at the other advances by the Russians here, it's more so just a confirmation of Ukrainian withdrawals from pockets that were just not going to be held onto anyway. A lot of these areas are near ponds, near local ravines, forested regions, dugouts that were built over the course of a while. So now the Russians are just solidifying control over all these large swaths of open territory and using that as a base to then advance further. And the goal is to reach an area like Zabalka. But based on the preliminary sort of like outbursts that occurred on September 21st, there's also an intention to utilize the rail line in the villages surrounding it to put pressure onto New York, or I should say Toretsk's western flank. But also it could be to undermine this vertical line of defense that is supposed to be acting as a protector of the flank for a large cluster of Ukrainian forces that have been untouched so far in this red rectangle. But that is more so of a future speculative operation. For now, we just have to wait and see. Looking to the northeast, this is where we actually do have insane developments from Toretsk itself, with the Russians largely pushing through into the city center from one main axis, not from a flank, but actually pushing through along the main road, which would be the most dangerous means by which to do so. But the Russians actually have been able to, make steady gains on nearly a daily basis. So here we have a video. It's from, let's see, September 27th, from the Voron unit of FPV strikes onto Russian squads near Nakhailivka. That's this sort of settlement over here. It's part of Toretsk. I'm marking it with an X. Zabalka is over here. And then the first micro district is over here in the large X. So the first micro district has largely been cleared by the Russians. The Russians have footage here. It's from, let's see, the 26th of September. And it shows here you have a grenade drop onto a Russian soldier that was operating in these houses. He was sort of at the sort of vanguard of the advance here. So he was targeted by the grenades. And it shows how deep the Russian infiltration really is, and that there are holes in the Ukrainian defense, because being able to infiltrate into an urban area that's really dense, which has a lot of reinforcements, you would presume, and a lot of high-rise buildings nearby, it should be something that's difficult and repelled really quickly. But in this case, you have very small Russian squads being able to assert themselves and not being pushed back. In fact, then being able to expand even deeper into the settlement. And so here you have confirmation of control over the correctional facility. Again, Russians are now working on clearing out some of the private residential buildings over here, one story, and then also some of the duplexes. At the same time, the Ukrainians remain in control over the western portion of the citadel, with the Russians infiltrating into the eastern section. So there's now clashes going on, because the fall of the citadel really would entail the rest of the city ending up falling. It could take a while, but the Russians having control over such massive buildings would be huge gain for them on a local level. And again, you're seeing it all occur from a very narrow axis, you could say. A lot of it coming in from the 132nd Brigade. There's a few other units here, some elements of the Veterans PMC, although I'm aware that it also has a presence in Kursk. You have the 109th Motor Rifle Regiment. You have, as we said before, Somali Assault Battalion operating around here. So you do have a garrison, also including the Slavic Motor Rifle Brigade, also split because it has some elements in Kursk. Zooming in, you also have this video. Let's click on it. It's from the recent days. Full capture of Pivnishnya confirmed based on a video from the 28th, I believe. Mechanized Brigade, they dropped mines onto Pivnishnya on September 24th, verifying that there is Russian control there. Now to zoom in on Nevsky, we have here Russians capturing the southern portion, as we've talked about in earlier videos, amounting to nearly 4 square kilometers. The Russians have already been able to reach the Zherbets River. We have a geolocation here. It is from September 21st of a Russian flag being raised in southern Nevsky. And again, so far, you do still have remnants of the original garrison from here defending in the northern portion. So it's not been fully taken over by Russia. Although if it were to fall, then it would be used as a forward operating base to begin cleansing operations of the rest of the Zherbets River Valley. So you have a really rather large Ukrainian, at least on paper, organizational structure in this region, including, if we're going to click on it, it's territorial defense units. There are a few mechanized brigades defending in the region. And really, despite that fact, the Russians were able to achieve that really 30 square kilometer breakthrough in this area earlier on in September that was able to give them control over the gullies to make it into southern Nevsky. So now the situation is sort of not as clear as to where the Russians are actually in control of, because a lot of Nevsky remains a gray zone. So we're going to wait and see for clarification about that. I also want to see if this video from Makivka is recent. Yes, it is. It's a video of Ukrainian drones dropping grenades onto ruins in northwestern Makivka, confirming the Russians crossed over the Zherebets River and are now solidifying control over the actual houses here. And you could see how there's going to be a sort of unity between Nevsk and Makivka, where you're going to have two settlements on the river that the Russians can take over and then cross. And then they could go from there, branching out in whatever direction they deem fit. Could be southwards to the rest of the Zherebets River Valley. It could be east, or I should say westwards, towards an area like Kurakhove, or sort of outlying Ukrainian positions before the actual trench lines that you see marked over here in yellow. That is also, of course, a possibility. You could also look at these gains made by the 12th Azov Brigade. I think it was last month, that still haven't been reversed, so that could also be an objective. And one of the main units involved in the Nevsk operation is the 144th Brigade. I want to see if they're located over here so I can click on their icon, but they played a big role in pushing through. Now, to look at the Kupiansk front, specifically at the breakthrough out of Pischane, we can see here Russian advance amounting to, in terms of the yellow, 10 square kilometers, so it is a large swath of territory. But the Ukrainians recently have moved in additional resources to prevent the Russians from cutting off the Oskil River from this village over here, Kurakhove. So here is geolocation from September 23rd of the Pomsta Revenge Brigade National Guard unit of grenade drops onto Russian forces just east of said village. There was also reports from the 2nd Battalion of the 115th Brigade, where they dismounted a BMP-1 and retook some trenches east of the village. So about a week ago, there were some attempted counterattacks, which sort of stalled the line for a while. But then you had the Russian forces, according to the Ukrainian side, organize a massive armored assault, reminiscent of what we saw occur around, Novomikhailivka, Konstantinivka earlier on, a couple of months ago. Those really massive assaults that the Ukrainian Air Force were targeting a lot, or air assault forces. And so in this case, the Ukrainian forces from the 92nd Brigade, specifically the Achilles UAV unit, they claimed to have encountered 50 Russian vehicles. And then they gave specific numbers as to how many they damaged and destroyed. And also they released footage of some of the damage. So Achilles say that they destroyed 14 units of equipment, including 5 BMPs, 3 tanks, 1 APC, and then 1 MTLB, along with 2 Euro trucks and 1 UAZ 452 loaf van. Of course, also 1 quad bike. 26 vehicles were also damaged during the assault, according to Ukrainians, including 10 tanks, 10 BMPs, 1 Brem armored recovery vehicle, and then also 1 Euro and 3 MTLBs. Of course, not all of that was shown in the footage. It is actually a really large ratio compared to what I've seen claimed from the 79th Air Assault Brigade in similar size assaults that occurred. But again, in terms of the actual geolocation, there is footage of drones targeting a large quantity of tanks and BMPs in and around the area east of Kurakhove. So for now, the Ukrainians have been able to repel whatever armored assaults have come from the 1st Guards tank army operating in this region. And that is of the utmost necessity, because if they lose control over this region, then it's going to be much easier to divide and conquer, to push southwards through open regions and undermine the entirety of the Ukrainian rear in this region on the eastern bank of the Oskil River, and then also, of course, Kupiansk. And yeah, that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.